Уважаемые друзья, доброе утро. Просьба занимать места. Как только в зал войдет Антон Германович Силуанов, мы сразу начнем работать. А войти он... Уважаемые дамы и господа.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, I congratulate you on the launch of the 20th April Academic Conference on social economic issues. That's an anniversary conference. That's the 20th conference, and it is being held on the eve of the Jubilee of the founding father of the conference, Dr. Yasin. Please bring your gift in the form of substantiated papers that could serve as a basis for the work of the business community, of the State Duma, of the government as a cohesive team thinking about the prospects of the country's development. I would like to give the first floor to the first Deputy Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, Minister of Finance, Anton Siluanov, for reading out the message of greetings of the President of the Russian Federation to the conference. To the participants and guests of the 20th April Academic Conference on Economic and Social Issues of Countries' Development. I welcome you on the occasion of the 20th Anniversary Academic Conference organized by the National Research University, the Higher School of Economics. In the past years, the conference has become a necessary item in the calendars of research events, bringing together prominent scholars, civil servants, expert community members, and the business community from the various countries. The forum is famous for its dense agenda, the high level of discussions, and the authoritative and prestige level of the participants, and allowing us to discuss the issues facing the regions and national economy, and improvement of the regional economies and develop approaches to tackling existing issues. I am convinced that the conference will be held in a constructive, creative spirit, serving to strengthen international cooperation in scholarly research, and its results will enhance the quality of the expert support for government activity. I wish you fruitful work and all the best. Vladimir Putin. Dear colleagues, we will not necessarily work in keeping with what is written in the agenda. The first speaker is Anton Siluanov, but then to balance the executive and legislative power, we shall ask Andrei Makarov. I agree with everything that Anton Siluanov is going to say. You want to immediately say that you are in agreement. No, you will get some new impressions from the speech. He knows the agenda of the work of the government. And then further on, depending upon how effective we are with the timing, because some of the colleagues asked to excuse themselves, and perhaps we give the floor to Vladimir Mao, who is has other appointments, or Yaroslav Kuzminov. I will listen to what he has to say, and he will not. Yaroslav, let me remind the audience that normally at April conference we hear papers, and for the first session the traditional paper is Yaroslav Kuzminov Kendinova paper about their prospects of economic development, and I want you not only to comment who will speak before you, but also say a few words about your paper, and then Dr. Yasin and Kudinova will complement what you have to say. Anton Siluanov, the prospects of Russia economic development scenarios. Please limit yourself to the optimistic scenario. We want to live in the bright future and know how to get there. Thank you, Alexander. Good morning, dear colleagues. My topic is scenarios of development of the Russian economy and the budget policy and fiscal policy at the current stage. Speaking about the economy and the budget, I would like to know that in the past several years we have done quite a lot, creating a basis and foundation for further reforms and structural change. In the past several years, we have removed macroeconomic imbalances. We enhanced the resilience of the economy to external shocks and effects, the changing external conditions on which the Russian Federation had depended so much, like energy prices, and enhanced resilience to the external actions, like certain limiting factors. We have strengthened our finances, including regional finances. Regions stopped accumulating debt, which contributed to the instability of the entire fiscal structure, and the debt level is now going down. We have created mature financial market institutions that each of you can testify to and confirm. And this has allowed us to have increased growth rates over 2% in the past year, which does not appear big, but it's higher than the average rate of growth for the past decade. This gradual progression and advance and the stability of the national currency, we have seen in the past several years, we have seen external factors having negative effects on the economic development. And all of this shows that we have created a foundation for the national economy to be less dependent on external effects. A few words about the fiscal policy. We have carried out several measures, the fiscal rule, reducing the budget dependence on external prices and situations. The budget balance is assured at the $45 per barrel oil price. Last year, we have achieved a budget deficit of 2.6%. We have formed sufficient reserves. Unlike other countries, emerging economies also dependent on energy prices, we have not increased our liabilities or debt levels, but conducted a balanced fiscal policy, and all investors have noted this. Despite all the projections and forecasts, despite the bills that are there in the U.S. Congress, our fixed bonds are quite in demand. The risks on them are minimum, and we see the inflow of resources into the Russian financial market this year. This is a foundation, but we need to move on. We need to achieve the tasks set by the president. The key tasks in the economy are in the form of national goals to increase growth rate at the average global level, to become part of top 5 countries globally, having the largest economy sizes. These are not simple tasks. And we have formulated several decisions on that. We have a resource base in place to fund national project as one of the tools to achieve national goals set by in the presidential decree. We have changed tax legislation. We have defined and determined sources for funding the budget deficit, with subnational entities involved in this task. Without the regions, without self-management, one cannot achieve economic tasks and goals. We have defined and determined resources, 27.5 trillion rubles budget of budgetary sources, self-management, subnational entities. The entire country is now being involved in the achieving of the tasks set by the president. To ensure the required growth rate, we need investment. If one looks at the structure of the economies of the countries that have achieved higher growth rates, they have high savings rate and investment rates. And the task to achieve investment resources at least 25% of the GDP. Now it's slightly more than 21%, which is not enough. And to achieve high growth rates, a breakthrough, we need good investment activity. It's not so much the money of the budget, but the money of the investors. Alexander Shokhin with his union should be involved. And we are interacting with the business community to create conditions to reduce investment risks. Number 2, to create opportunities and possibilities for accumulation of funds for such investment, and create terms and conditions to create a competitive environment, not to have an economy with a large footprint of the state. Reducing risks. We have created a predictable and stable conditions. I'm talking about the fiscal rule on the one hand. On the other hand, the fiscal rule is also important for the business. The ruble exchange rate is stable, which is key. The stability and predictability and independence of the national economy from external factors. Well, all the recent crisis phenomena in Russian economy were due to the fact that the budget system was not prepared to withstand external effects and shocks. Now it's a different situation. The fiscal rule, stability of the taxation system, we have agreed that we will not change the tax environment for the next 6 years. That's the basis for our predictability for the business operation. Then further on, fair competition. Obviously, there are quite a lot of criticism because government-owned companies with government stakes have certain preferential treatment relative to other companies, and there's justified criticism. What we'll be creating a more competitive environment, not only by involving private business and but also and through other factors. With regard to we need to create a level play field. I mean, those who are operating in the gray area and those who are law-abiding. We need a better level of administration, and it's becoming more and more difficult to get away from the customs tax service oversight. There's an electronic database covering all tax payers, and those who had used loopholes to get away from paying taxes or contribution or charges and to get preferential terms for themselves. The number of these entities is going down, and this tax administration will continue to be improved. The second thing, reducing the administrative load. And the business have sensed and experienced that although we moved from 130 to 30 in doing business ratings, now the task is to be part of top 20. But not only this, we are improving conditions for business operation. It takes less time to launch a business. Administrative procedures are being streamlined. The customs service can be commended and given credit. The customs procedures have been streamlined too. But this can be done electronically online. And reducing this kind of costs is also important for businesses to enhance and improve a mood for investment. Then we create conditions for businesses returning into Russian jurisdiction. The capital amnesty is continuing, which was requested by our colleagues from the Union of Entrepreneurs. The decision is in place, and there are two administrative regions have been created in Russia, having a status which is similar to those offshore tax havens where our capital used to flow, believing that they feel more protected there. We have created similar special administrative regions. You're welcome. Come back. And we see this process underway. These are the kind of things we have not given thought to and would not have done in the past. But we see there is a need for and demand for these actions, and this is exactly what we're doing. The next item is how, besides removing administrative barrier, what other actions and measures can be done. Promoting business projects, and businesses have money, a lot of money. I think I made a great mistake when I agreed to moderate this session. Maybe Dr. Kuzminov will go on moderating it. Now our task is to come to agreement with our colleagues from Union of Entrepreneurs and large and medium businesses to agree that the resources available in the economy. But we know the past year, 2018, the largest profits were made by Russian companies. To transform these profits into specific projects, we have a task force in place with Alexander Shokin. With the Union of Entrepreneurs, not Shokin. Our government task force jointly with businesses, entrepreneurs, who will work on specific projects, removing the kind of constraints and limitations that the business is complaining about.
I would like to say that this is a good piece of work we've done. We've looked at the specific investment projects, and based on that analysis, we conduct meetings with our agencies. We reduce administrative barriers. Based on our interaction with our colleagues, we have prepared two very serious draft laws, a new version of the special investment contract law and a law on the protection and attracting investment in the Russian economy. These are the proposals we're getting from the business community, and this is something that will ensure that resources are invested in the economy. I'm talking about the resources that were received over the recent years, reinvested in the Russian economy. In addition to this, we are developing the long money institutions, and we've reached an agreement with our colleagues from the central bank, and we have prepared draft laws about the voluntary system of retirement contributions. They are going to be voluntary plans, and this is going to be an important tool for improving the size of the retirement benefits, and also a tool to ensure there are long investments flowing into the economy. This is something that we really need in this situation where we see that a lot of various restrictions are imposed on attracting private money from foreign jurisdictions because of the sanctions and restrictions that exist around Russia. In addition to this, we have prepared a large package of measures to stimulate investments. We're talking about subsidies, tax incentives, especially in the area of oil and gas and petrochemistry. These are the industries that are going to be evolving very rapidly and something that will contribute to the growth of the economy. There is another important factor of economic growth I would like to allude to, and this is something that we want to achieve by implementing national projects. They are aimed at incentivizing this development. We're talking about the infrastructure. There are two projects, the transportation infrastructure and safe and quality roads. We're talking about the digitalization of the economy, which is going to be capital investment. So we will have focus on the digitalization. This is something that will make the life of the business community easier, will make the economy more transparent and more comfortable for the business community. I'm talking about another project, improving the labor productivity, and the small and medium enterprise project. These are the areas that are the center of our focus, the focus of our attention, and at the economic block of our government, we are conducting meetings with the various oblasts and regions of Russia. We meet with the members of the business community, and I'm sure that we're going to see some progress in the coming year. Just one example. In our plans for this year, we want to increase the volume of loans that will be issued to the small and medium enterprises. Last year, that level was 80 billion rubles. This year, this is going to be increased. That's our plan, by a factor of 10. That's going to be close to 1 trillion rubles. That will allow us to create new jobs for the SMEs, and our goal is to increase the number of small and medium enterprises from 19 million to 25 million people employed there. We create special regimes in this area. There will be some beneficial regimes for starting your business. I'm talking about the so-called self-employed individuals. We are conducting an experiment that is going to be expanded next year. And in addition to this, we are getting ready, based on the digitalization of our economy, getting ready for streamlining the reporting requirements, making the work of the business communities easier. Another goal that is related to the growth of the economy is the increase of exports. Without exports, we cannot ensure that we are competitive. On the other hand, we cannot increase the growth rate of the economy. So there is a serious project that is under implementation by the government. It's a project to incentivize resource exports. Over the next 6 years, we want to increase, or rather non-resource, non-commodity exports. We want to increase it sixfold. And that is why we are entering into agreements with the companies who will be getting support from the government if they export such non-commodity products. And we hope that this project is going to provide good results this year, and we hope that these non-resource experts are going to grow this year quite dramatically. Speaking about what the business requires, we want to really liberalize our foreign exchange legislation. You heard about the package of measures that was prepared by the government and the central bank to liberalize our laws in the form of making it easier for the companies to return their currency income and reduce the burden of administrative and even criminal persecution that is sometimes a factor for those that operate in this market. So all of these vestiges that we still have from the Soviet era, they will no longer be a factor. Speaking about streamlining the work of the business community, this would include revision and repealing of those outdated solutions and decisions that have been in place for decades, and they are now a burden and an obstacle. By 2021, all of these decisions will have to be revised, repealed if necessary, and all of those that are not needed will be rid of. That is the focus of our efforts, of the government's efforts, trying to get rid of the undue legal burden. So this is a large package of documents, beginning with the fiscal policies, with the budget, with the national projects, and obviously I'm also referring to the work that we do in the area of improving our legislation, easing the burden on the business community and making the laws and legislation more straightforward and streamlined, reducing those burdens that our country has to deal with. And that is something that will allow our business community to act on their own instead of looking at potential offshore havens elsewhere abroad and look for good income. And hopefully this is what your organization, Mr. Shokin, is going to be doing as well. Well, we need to create a joint organization of the business community so that we could reach an agreement with them. We need to add the APORA and the Chamber of Industry and Commerce, and in that case we're going to be able to work together. Or maybe you will be added to the Axis organization. Well, dear colleagues, the main thrust of Mr. Silovanov's report was that indeed we aim at improving predictability of our economic policies for the next 6 years. This is associated with the support for the business community through tax incentives and special regimes, including the so-called special investment contracts and the corporate program for improving competitiveness and so on. But Mr. Silovanov, among those universal tools and mechanisms, there are discussions that are taking place and have taken place at your office several times, and the discussions center on the following. We need to introduce a mechanism for deferring the introduction of those laws that worsen the situation of the business community. And in the context of this law on incentivizing and stimulating investment, there is now an article there, and I understand it is now being discussed, because it needs to be fleshed out. This is one of those revolutionary things that we should do, defer the introduction of this law, not by 6 months, as was the case in the tax laws case, as we discussed with Mr. Makarov, but maybe in some cases can be deferred for as long as 2 years. Is this something that you are looking at? Absolutely. This idea was suggested by the business community. And what really worried our entrepreneurs is that very often changes are introduced in the way the business community is regulated that forces them to change their business plans and business models. And that is not something that contributes to the predictability of the government. What we agreed on is that those regulatory measures that are adopted, be that in the area of technical regulation, oversight, control, they have to be introduced, but with the deferred implementation. Let's say we have certain laws on taxes right now, but before any budget laws are implemented, all of the tax laws have to be in place, and that's a good approach. And we've made a step further from there. We suggested that whenever we talk about the introduction of new regulations that will negatively impact the business community or could impact them adversely, they have to be announced at least 2 years ahead of the actual implementation. That will increase the level of predictability and the reliability of our business climate. Let me ask you another question. You mentioned the need to decriminalize some of the areas of the legislation we have in place, including the foreign exchange legislation, but there is an excessive burden from the law enforcement on the business community, and that is one of the main impediments to development of the companies, an impediment to getting more investment. And you've talked about those objective measures that you can take. That includes our progress in the doing business rating. We started at 112th position and then we moved up significantly. But that alone doesn't give us really a breakthrough in the investment process. Many believe that what is at fault here is that excessive burden on the business. We know that at the moment the government is readying a new version of the Code on Administrative Proceedings, and we want this code to be changed together with the criminal code so that some of the chapters and articles from the criminal code would be migrating to the administrative code, and that would decriminalize some of the economic crimes. And in addition to this, there is another matter, and maybe it's something that we should discuss at the control and supervision session tomorrow. We need to make sure that the people should not be taken into custody if they are being investigated under, let's say, Article 108 of the Criminal Code, because these are purely economic crimes. And in some cases, they use Article 210, talking about organized communities, criminal communities, and that destroys the businesses of many of the entrepreneurs, and that should be probably replaced with house arrests or a note not to leave the place of a abode. And that could be something that could be used additionally to the measures that have been taken, and I understand the government is looking into this, and the President has mentioned this more than once in his address and at the meetings at the General Prosecutor's Office and at other venues. I understand that you are in charge of the economic matters, but you also have your eye on issues like this regulatory guillotine, as it is sometimes called, the administrative code, the decriminalization of some articles, and so on. Is my understanding correct that that's your course? Absolutely. Indeed. We do want to take another look at those regulatory authorities that we have, and we want to see what we can do to optimize how we exercise our control. And at the same time, I agree that all of the government agencies have to be involved and engaged in ensuring that we reach those goals that the President set before us. That includes economic growth and building the business community, definitely. And I agree that law enforcement has to participate as well, participate in the implementation of those national goals and objectives set before us by the President, and help create conditions for making the work of our entrepreneurs more comfortable. Speaking about predictability of business environment, the fiscal system plays an important role. The tax systems, the so-called non-tax payments that Mr. Makarov hasn't yet moved to the tax code yet, but within this year, I understand Mr. Makarov is going to do this together with the government and the business community. And again, this is another matter that will contribute to predictability, although the business is resisting this. They do not want to pay some additional price, such as the additional criminal charges that could be leveled against someone who is not paying the environmental fees. But at least if we introduce this deferment of tax laws, at least 6 months prior to being implemented, that would really help. It is important that we have it really written down quite clearly. And if tax decisions are being made, they would have to be put into effect after a year has passed, and not from the 1st of January of the next year. And I'm sure there are a lot of other things that Mr. Makarov wants to talk to us about. He's already said that he is in agreement with what Mr. Silivanov has said. But if Mr. Makarov, you want to really praise Mr. Silivanov for something, please, this is your opportunity. Thank you. You started with the business community, and I'm convinced that we should either talk good things about the business community or should say nothing, because I don't want to say anything good and I don't want to say anything bad, and therefore I would move to another topic. In fact, I would like to talk about 3 main issues. They may be disjointed, but at the same time, realistically, they show us. Well, can we take away this slide, and I will just concentrate on what I'm about to say, because that slide was about investment, and everyone will think that I will be encouraging you to invest. Instead, I will talk about something else. Okay, that's a deal. But let's not show this slide yet. So, there are 3 questions I would like to dwell on. The rate of economic growth, especially that was the end line of Mr. Silovanov. He said that the goal is to increase the growth of economic rate. The second issue is the condition and the status of our regions and their readiness to be involved in the implementation of those programs that Mr. Silovanov has mentioned. And the third issue I would like to focus on, and that is something that has been referenced by Mr. Shokin. It's the investment climate. He said something along the lines that we should not just use the criminal code, but maybe some articles of the administrative code should be involved. Well, let me say that speaking about the economic growth, the goal is to have our growth rate higher than the world growth rates, and it's very important that that is something, that is the idea that was supported by our Ministry for Economic Development. The current budget was looked at through the prism of how the 2018 budget was implemented, and everyone in the government and in the central bank agreed that the assessment of economic growth rate in 2018 of 1.8% was absolutely exact. But a few months passed, and the economic growth, thanks to very serious efforts of the Ministry for Economic Development, in 2018, that level reached 2.3%. Indeed, Russia is becoming a country with unpredictable economic history. And in that sense, it seems to me that we are on the path of resolving this very important objective, outstripping the world economic growth rates. And that is something that could be achieved due to the fact that we see certain issues happening with the world economies. We are developing quite steadily, and the world growth rates are now sliding down. These are interrelated issues. And whenever we look at the draft budget, and the Minister for Economic Development made a prediction that we do take into consideration the reduction of the growth rate, and that is what we have in mind when we set before ourselves the goal of outstripping the world economic growth rate. But I would like to mention a thing that might sound odd, but it is something that we ought to draw our attention to. we are talking about a lot of funds that the government has been able to find to implement our national projects. And that is something that should incentivize our economic growth. Obviously, these funds cannot kick in right away. You need some initial time for the mechanisms to start operating. And when you start explaining that they will kick in later and will contribute to the economic growth in 2020, that is the logic that I do understand. However, why do we forecast our economic growth and base it on the 2019 growth rate numbers of 1.9%? So we're talking about a reduction of the growth rate by 1 percentage point. Given how much money we are investing in the economy, that probably requires some explanation.
Unfortunately, since we've just heard Mr. Reshkin's presentation in the State Duma, but actually there was no report made, and the minister didn't have time to respond to this question. But we have to answer this question: why do we forecast a slowdown in the growth rate in 2019? What are the reasons and factors that we failed to make additional money, but those in the budget continue to operate? We need to look for some other causes and factors, and we need to consider what is going on in the world. The Rubini and others were very cautious in making and advancing their conclusions last year. Now it's more or less clear-cut. The Brookings Institute and Financial Times issued their analytics showing that what we see is parallel and synchronous slowdown in the growth rate. And in developing countries, it will be more greater than in developed countries. And the situation where we do not take into account the slowdown in growth rate and how it will affect our economy is not the right thing to do, because reduction of and slowdown in growth rate in the United States and other developed countries does affect our national economy, and we are not analyzing this. The whole world agrees that a situation of unpredictability, where so many factors there are in place driving this slowdown, the monetary and fiscal measures are not able to incentivize and promote economic growth. There should be some other drivers and factors. And the business is telling us that we need tax preferences and benefits. We are zones of accelerated development. All the country is a zone of accelerated, better than special zone or other zones like prisons. Yeah, one can never be sure that they will not have this experience. Yeah, apart from our vacation zones, there are other zones. Yeah, now we are discussing more substantive things. My thrust is different. 22nd of March, for the first time in the past several years, quarterly bonds, government bonds, their returns exceeded the 10-year bonds for the first time. This inversion took place on the 22nd of March. One can say it is one of the indices, others say it's a key index, but the world experience shows when this happens, within 12 months, there's an economic crisis that is going to emerge. We are on the eve of a serious global economic recession, and we now building our economic policy, this is what we should bear in mind. The export-oriented economy is fine, but our export products, with the backdrop of global decline, who will need that? We need to look for resources inside the country. We need to look at the possibility of domestic consumption of what we are producing. And I think, unfortunately, this aspect is not being analyzed sufficiently in our economic policy building. Why did I say that I agree that Anton said, if we have this oncological centers, early diagnostics will be built, that is fine. People will have a better life, I hope. But one should bear in mind the possibility of a very serious shock on our economy, and ready and prepare ourselves for this impact. And one would like to look at the extent the regions are ready for such situations. What Anton was talking about, the financial indicators in the regions. If you look at the last year, the regions got 1.7 trillion rubles more of incomes that they had planned. A very significant growth in subnational incomes. In real terms, if one looks at the first 3 months of this year, the first quarter of this year, the growth of regional incomes is 12% on the first quarter of the previous year. The incomes, the individual income tax, is huge growth that the regions had not planned for. And I said the 1.7 trillion income growth last year, but the growth of expenditures is 501 billion, less than 1/3. So the regions spent less than 1/3 of additional incomes. Now, the regions have almost 2 trillion rubles of free funds. And this amount has grown since the 1st of January this year. So the regions keep accumulating funds. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm here to note this fact as fact. We're facing a situation where neither regional funds nor federal budget funds, with regard to the goals that Anton was talking about, are not being used to achieve those. There is an order, existing order, and now everybody agrees that it should be changed, and this work has started. But the situation is where we adopt a budget end of November, early December. Agreements are made between the federal center with subnational authorities by the 15th of February, and then competitions and tenders are announced according to RF Law 44. And then at best, this money will come for those purposes in June or July at best. Even the situation is even worse with road construction, because road construction is a part of inter-budget transfer funding. We have seen a serious increase of federal center funds coming to the regions, because it's so much easier for the ministries and departments. But subsidies have to be distributed and through the budget items. For regions to plan their activities, when they adopt their budgets, they need to know in advance what they can rely on in terms of federal budget transfers. Yeah, we keep saying that predictability and business stability is important. And the stability and predictability for regions, is that not important when we plan our tax-related activity? It may not sound popular, but I'm deeply convinced that the tax policy in Russia and the tax legislation in Russia has nothing to do in today's life to the investment climate. I'm saying something wrong. If I'm saying something wrong, I will go over to greetings. No, we had different kind of discussions with entrepreneurs. They ask for tax novelties. I don't agree to have only a discussion between the union and the government. Yeah, our platform and forum for the budget and taxes is the best. I don't think we should give preferential treatment to others at the expense of others. Preferential treatment is always at the expense of something else. No preferential treatment is fair in that sense. But when we give the business preferential treatment at the expense of the regions, they will put additional load on the businesses to compensate for lost incomes. Either we will support the balance and maintain the balance, but unfortunately the union interpreters, their voice historically is heard so much more than the voice of Republic Tiva. The Perm territory has come up of their interpretation of their real estate and other property, and the business lost in that discussion. You're creating a situation where everybody is speaking and nobody is listening. Among the attendees, you were the only anchor in a talk show on television. So, again, Andrei, before this session, he said he had not spoken at the last but one forum, so he will speak long. And then a disco dancing, of course. I can stop. This income made by the regions is something quite ambiguous, because 55% of individual income tax revenues is with the 10 leading regions, and 50% of income is also for 10 regions. For the other regions, for the rest of the region, the situation is far from that favorable. But unfortunately, in terms of economic indicators, it's only when it fits the federal targets, and the federal ministries are dividing and multiplying, adding and subtracting, only when it fits the national indicators. I know that I should be closing. Dr. Yashin is asking me whether he will have enough time to speak. Very briefly, let me give an example to prove that I am not inventing things. The first slide. These are target indicators. No, that's, yeah, investment into fixed assets. Subregions. In red color is the target to be reached. And blue, that's the reality that we had. Why will it is going to happen federally? And there is no explanation why we should get there. Of course, I'm convinced these are well-substantiated numbers. And the second slide, please. This is Murmansk Oblast. Blue color is the reality in the past in Murmansk region, and the red is what they should do, they should accomplish. And the third slide. I can show you data on all the 85 regions, leaving no time for Yevgeny. Kurgan regions. I can show you data for all the 85 regions. But you see, many of these indicators are higher than the average national. And that's the real picture of what is going on with regard to the share of investment in expenditure in the consolidated budgets of subnational. They keep going down. Why should they grow next year is a question to which we want to get an answer from the Minister of Economic Development, because so far the Minister of Economic Development have sent their targets to the regions and said you should comply. And of course they will have to. What options do they have? This is something we could discuss with regard to any and each specific target indicator. My point is the barriers that may impede achieving the tasks that Mr. Silionov was talking about. The investment climate, one word. As a lawyer, or no, I forgot that life as a lawyer. The first day of the investment forum in Sochi, we have Musky show in agro-industrial holdings with the police storming their offices, and last day foreign investors are detained. Everything that happened in the Sochi Investment Forum, that 1 trillion ruble worth of contracts made during the forum, those convincing presentations about what is the right things being done for business to invest in are deprived of any sense and meaning, because the frame is provided for perceiving all these things for these tests. And I have to agree with leading world experts. Mike Spence is a Nobel Prize winner. That today monetary and fiscal measures have exhausted their impact on economic growth worldwide. I think this is not just true for Russia, but it should be multiplied. For us to change the investment climate, we need to change the way our law enforcement agencies operate. The rest has negligible impact or none. What the rest that you're saying, taxes, Mr. Silionov knows we're doing this jointly. How does one reconcile the interests of the regions and the businesses? We're talking about the two keys rule for taxes. In our main directions of the government, this was approved by the government 2017. When money is allocated to the regional budgets, the regions decide how to spend them. Then the businesses and the subnational authorities sit down together and decide, not the union of entrepreneurs federally and the federal government, but each specific region. The authorities and the regional business decide what kind of preferential treatment they will get. The correct thing we did was to replace the preferential treatment by investment preferential treatment, to make this real and promote investment growth. Now a law is adopted to expand possibilities for this preferential treatment, but so far these are one-off decisions. It's not yet a system. Perhaps legislatively we should adopt this norm and rule, two keys rule. It is not just part of the main directions, but become part of the law. If there are preferential treatments with regard to regional taxes, they can be only given if the federal budget pays compensations. So we should stop regulate regional liabilities federally, which not have money in place to meet those liabilities, because today regional liabilities are federally regulating 65 to 70% from region to region, and this situation, which hampers implementation of those serious tasks set, and most important, is creating risk for effective use of those huge funds that the government managed to find, and it could theoretically work to improve the economic growth situation. I think we have similar understanding, but I want us to move faster along this path without trying, through manipulation of statistics, to embellish the situation to please the boss or bosses. Thank you, Andrei. I want to ask Mr. Silvanov, do you have any comment? Andrei, very interesting contribution. A few points. Why 2.3 last year growth and 1.3 this year? We expected a slowdown in growth rate. We introduced additional VAT, and the money we planned to receive and inject them into the economy by way of investment or national projects, according to our estimates, they are to get into the economy by the end, by the second half year. We are slow to start, but I'm sure we will ride fast. Nevertheless, the data for the first 2 months turned out to be much more optimistic. And we see national growth rate about 1.5%.
Although when we made our estimate, that was initially equal to 1.3, the first 2 months were supposed to show lower growth rates, according to our forecasts. So now we can say that if this trend continues, we can have a higher growth rate throughout the year. That's number one thing. The second thing, it is true there are risks that are associated with the world economy. They are real risks, and measures of credit and budgetary and fiscal incentives, be that in the United States or in Europe, those measures no longer work. In Europe, they have nearly negative rates. In the United States, there was the trend towards increasing the rates, and then the IFRS said that there will be no further increases. But those measures of incentivizing the economy are no longer usable. We can see that a lot of government debt has been accumulated in the budgetary systems, be that in Europe or in the United States or in China even. So, speaking about incentives in the monetary area or budgetary area, those measures have exhausted themselves. There are risks that are associated with trade wars and confrontations, and none of that contributes to improving the growth rates of the economy. And we can see that international financial institutions are reducing their projections for economic growth rates. Speaking about investments, I would like to say that I agree with what Mr. Makarov showed us on those slides, the trends with investments. I'm sure that those decisions that we are now preparing, and we would hope that you, Mr. Makarov, and your committee would support those measures that we have in place, the law on incentivizing investments, and we would like you to review those as quickly as possible so that the business community could start using them. Plus, the national projects would have a role, and they will create the general demand for the economy. Those national projects will kick in, and in the nearest months we're going to see the additional resources that will start flowing into the economy thanks to the implementation of those programs and national projects that we have in our budget. So I think that this year we are going to be able to achieve growth rates that will be at least at the level that we have in our forecast. I'm sure they will be high, and I hope that this trend will continue until the end of this year. Thank you, Mr. Siluanov. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I would now have to be a stricter moderator, observing the time limits. First of all, because Mr. Siluanov has to be at a meeting at 11 to chair a meeting, and unfortunately we haven't yet invented teleportation, and Mr. Mao asked us to let him go before or by 11:30, and so now we'd like to give the floor to Mr. Mao, the director of RENEPA, and please try to be as quick and terse as possible. Dear colleagues, but you have to say everything still. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. First of all, I would like to congratulate the High School of Economics on the Jubilee Conference, a wonderful conference. And being here, I just have to say that the recommendations of experts do come, but they come later. If you remember, when we wrote this 2020 strategy, the first chapter was dedicated to the economy of demand and supply. And we were thinking that given our macroeconomic conditions, it would be preferable to focus on the economy of supply. And the previous economy was more focused on the economy of demand. And now, based on the discussion that is going on and those concerns that have been voiced by Mr. Makarov, we can see that the discussion is finally focusing on the issue of investment and not on switching the investment towards growth. We can see that the regions are actually reinvesting the investment into costs such as salaries. Without calling anything black or white, I would like to say that the national projects of 2018 are very different from the policies of 2012, because now we are seeing that we are moving from the economy of demand to the economy of supply, which is very important for our economy. Now, the other question is how these investments are going to transpire and whether they're going to be state investments or private investments. We need to really have a lot of private investments. It's going to be even more important than the rates of economic growth. And my presentation, my talk, is going to be on those risks that I believe are very important from the standpoint of the economic policy that we have to implement given the risks. And I would agree with what Mr. Makarov said. There are external risks associated with the crisis and our adaptation to the crisis. The first thing I see as a serious risk, and thankfully it hasn't yet materialized, it's the risk of the national projects becoming the fetishes as such. We cannot use just the national projects as the indicator of growth. And the economic growth is important in as much it is the indicator of the improvement of living standards. And our experience over the last 30 years, the economic growth can go hand in hand with the reduction of the living standards. The opposite is also true. The example of Japan of the 90s and the early naught years is the factor that proves that. Of course, the growth has to go together with the modernization. We cannot see growth when there is lack of stability. The growth should not undermine economic stability, macroeconomic stability in particular, and the growth has to be long-term and not short-term. That means that the growth rates in the reference materials for the given decades is more important than what the report said in the State Duma. The 10-year growth rate is more important than the annual report. Mr. Mao, you mentioned what Mr. Siluanov is saying. They are looking ahead for 6 years. 10 years is probably a little bit too much. Well, I'm talking about the economic history more than the report of the government in the Duma. Well, okay, 6 years, the growth rate for, or over 6 years, is more important than the growth rate over 2 years, especially if it's followed by a decline. Another problem is the game of strategy, forming and then failing to achieve it. Strategies and plans cannot be implemented if a lot of factors that can contribute to their implementation are not known to us. And in that sense, whether a strategy is implementable or not, that's something that depends on whether we're talking about a strategy of getting out of a crisis. We're talking about the 1992 government program. Any government was supposed to implement a certain set of stabilization measures. And that would be really bad if it's just a strategy and nothing else, because this is not a document for the report, but rather something that would be used in order to develop a policy of coordinated efforts. The other issue is the conflict of long-term and short-term goals. And the example of growth is very important. Here, something that we can really report on over, let's say, a couple of years, it's not something that will be good for the long-term growth. You cannot really weaken your macroeconomic parameters because you will see the outcome later on. The third risk is of an institutional nature. And this is something that reminds me of an old rule. The laws may be bad, but or they may be good, but if they're not implemented, that's not going to affect our legislation. So we don't have the right for a mistake. If the laws are bad and still they have to be implemented and they have to be followed, that could be a real factor in slowing down how our growth is developing and all of the other parameters as well. And we have to really be straightforward about these issues and discuss what needs to be done about these factors. The fourth problem, or the risk, and Mr. Makarov has already mentioned that, is the underestimation of political factors when we're trying to estimate our economic factors. Of course, the politics have the domineering effect on our economy, and if you talk about the issue of security, personal safety, that will have the prevalence over other issues. And that's when we talk about taxes and benefits. All of these matters, they go to the background compared to issues of personal safety and security. And finally, I would like to mention the issue of the quality of human capital and migration balance. The influx of migration has slowed down, but we're still in a situation where the outflow is the outflow of those who can really go to, let's say, the West, and who comes to replace them are people of lower education, and they also feel good to being abroad. That is in Russia for them. They feel better, right? So it's the matter of the quality of the human capital in our migration balance, and that quality is going down, which decreases the demand for the quality of education and healthcare. And you need not just the money to improve the human capital, but we need to increase the demand for the service and the products that the subjects of this human capital produce. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mao, for your concise report, yet it was full of substance. And Mr. Kuzminov, while Mr. Siluanov is still here, a few comments, please. Yes, I would like to make a few commentaries on the presentation that's about to be made. And I would also like to respond to a number of talks that have already been made. Right, programs cannot be made for 10 years, especially under conditions when technologies, and that is something that defines the economy and the investments in the technology, they do not last 10 years, they last less than that. And therefore, you cannot really target your investments for that long. That will be too romantic, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a strategic vision. Your strategic vision should be a reserve and the source of growth for 10 to 20-year period of time. And if we neglect that vision, we are making an even larger mistake than trying to do a micro-planning. It seems to me that there are three main areas of reserve or sources that would contribute to additional growth for a period of 10 years plus. That's infrastructure and primarily the so-called digital infrastructure of the economy. It's the human capital and the institutions. We have been talking about the institutions, about something that would amount to a short-term investment. We'll change something and everything else will change. But institutions are not laws, written on paper and signed by the president. Institutions are expectations of people that certain other people will be acting according to what is written on the paper. That is the expectation of people from one another, and in that sense, we ought to ensure that we have long-term investment in our institutions. I totally agree with my colleagues who have spoken before me here that that in short, medium, and long-term planning, one of the key restricting factors is the restriction on economic activity associated with instability of our contracts and the relationship between contracts and property and ownership. Anything can be put into question, and what you can dispute is narrowed down to a venue where about 90% belongs to the state, and that doesn't insure you from claims against you, or it can be a case of simple non-action when there will be no investment activity. In that sense, it seems to me that, as Mr. Mao put it, we need to restore the right to making a mistake in the economy, because innovations are about making a sequence of mistakes. What do we need to make sure that that happens? In addition to the long-term things, we also need to take some immediate action. Number one, we need to reorient what our law enforcement is focused on. They should be focusing on ensuring economic growth and improvement of living standards of our citizens, on the one hand. On the other hand, they need to help us improve our national competitiveness on the global level. And that should become not just the goal of our governors and the members of the social ministries of the government, but also of the law enforcement. And there is a third goal. That is to ensure that we have a competitive regime in the economy. The other thing that we can do right away is to close the loopholes for in using criminal persecution as a way of resolving economic conflicts, such as, for example, using those parts of the criminal code that would essentially call the leadership of a company members of an organized crime group. That is something that should go away from our law enforcement practices. And we just should send to the community the signal that we want to go away from that. And I would also like to say a couple more things about our long-term actions. It seems to me that today we definitely have expended sufficient efforts to increase our investment into the digitalization of our economy and into the infrastructure, and we have not succeeded in investing in the human capital, both long-term, I'm talking about education and things like that. And let me remind you that we have shown the increase in the quality of our education that is contributed to by our national projects, and that's something that Mr. Siluanov talked about. There are also short-term things that you can do. That's our migration policies. They should be more active. And migration policies will produce much quicker results than the education reforms and the educational system. And if we defer by 1 year, let's say by 2020, by the summer of 2020, introduction of new proposals on inviting qualified and skilled personnel to our economy, that's not something that we should really see. I don't understand why we need to wait a whole year for that to happen. That is something that was the initiative of the Ministry of the Economic Development. I think this is something that can be done within a month's time. And if we just spend half an hour of this time, this is a way of fighting unemployment. Please don't interfere. I think that fighting unemployment isn't really that related to the so-called active migration policy. Mr. Makarov is saying that the Ministry of Economic Development needs to do something for the whole year. Let's not insult them. Too bad Mr. Oreshkin couldn't be here. That's why he has been really the subject of criticism from everyone, including myself, although I didn't intend to. Well, he has to be really careful about his scheduling. It seems to me, dear colleagues, that it would make sense to identify those areas that will drive the successes of our policies, and then we could discuss the advantages and disadvantages of those things we identified and the decisions that we make. If we don't do that, if we just discuss things in general, things are going to progress generally without really having any relevance for what we do. Thank you. Dear colleagues, our first part of our plenary session is over. We will let Mr. Siluanov go. We will thank him for spending 90 minutes with us at this session. And that is how much we've allotted to this part in our schedule. And it's too bad that we couldn't allow our colleagues to be with us all the time. Thank you very much again. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for the opportunity to speak here. I understand this is your Jubilee conference. It's the Jubilee of the April International Academic Conference. I would like to wish you a very fruitful conference, and I hope that those ideas that are going to be discussed here are going to be of interest, they're going to be engaging, and we are going to be able to implement those ideas in our specific actions that we will approve. And the important thing is to ensure that we have a higher growth rate and a greater rate of growth of the living standards of our citizens. That's the goal of any government. And we really need them right now. Thank you. Thank you. Let us thank Mr. Siluanov and Mr. Makarov and also Mr. Mao. We're not going to thank anyone else, and everyone else will have to stay put. And at the beginning of the session, colleagues, I mentioned that we were going to discuss the traditional report prepared by the experts of the High School of Economics. I would like to give the floor to Natalia Akindinova, who is the director of the Development Institute. She will talk about this report, these scenarios for economic development, based on the contributions or investment in the human capital. How much time do you need for your presentation? I think I need at least 15 minutes. Please stick to this time limit because we are not going to have a break, and we're not going to give people any tea or coffee, and people can step out and have their tea and bring it back in. Dear colleagues, I will begin my presentation with the brief identification of those challenges.
I will start by identifying the challenges facing the Russian economy on its path to sustainable growth. Some of those have been mentioned in the first part. Number one is a negative demographic trend leading to reduction of labor supply and distortion of employment structure. And these effects are not compensated for by the decision to increase the retirement age. Besides, despite the prudent fiscal policy, Russia continues to be vulnerable to global crises and a possible oil price decline. With regard to domestic issues, the rising monopolization and weak legal protection of businesses impedes investment and innovations. On the other hand, sanctions and other constraints impede the inflow and foreign capital and new technologies. Institutional development is quite contradictory. On the one hand, there's development market sector in the economy. On the other hand, recently the state footprint has been going up, suppressing the action of the market mechanisms and competition. Nevertheless, there is a possibility in Russia, also including a new stage of digitizations for enhancing the quality of life, for greater productivity and competitiveness. Our position is to make use of those. One should actively invest in human capital. The first slide, please. What we see here is the concept of the human capital. Starting 1960s, it has been recognized that healthcare, education, skill enhancement, and professional development is important for income growth and boosting productivity. And transition to the information economy only anchored these tendencies and trends. Starting 2000s, the importance of non-cognitive and social emotional skills is important, which goes beyond what conventional education teaches and trances, and the role of preschool education to shape personalities for economic performance. Evidently, in any economic conditions, education, health, and work skills and social skills make people more creative and more capable of innovations. This kind of intuitive conclusion confirmed experientially does have some scholarly difficulties in assessing these into economic growth, but the world scholarship has advanced. One most recent approach is decomposition of the productivity factors into specific factors. That's the World Bank paper showing that education accounts for 22–23% of variation, alongside with infrastructure, institutions, and these factors are well correlated with the total productivity factors. And this also shows that there's a less noticeable correlation between the quality of institutions, macroeconomic issues, with the total productivity, may be due to the fact that institutions are very slow to change. And that's a long-term process, rather. Another perspective and approach to assessing the contribution of human capital to economic growth that we're using in our paper involves development of the World Bank approach in their most recent report of 2019 that expands the human capital index used in the economic growth model. And that comprises not only education, not only the number of years in education like it was done in earlier papers, but also education quality indicators, which was proved at the micro level. I mean, the importance of this for economic performance, personal economic performance. And now it's included at the macro level as well. The proxy for health indicators is survival of people in the working ages and infant and children's survival. For Russia, the human capital assessment is 0.73, which means that Russian productivity is 70% of the productivity with full education level and ideal health. It's a good indicator. But there's also room for improvement. In our view, although there's a very broad human capital index, it has its limitations. This index does not take into account sufficiently the factors that are being discussed currently, the effect of cognitive and social behavioral skills on productivity, and the quality of higher education and adult education. In our view, there is room for greater use of human capital index in economic growth models. For many of these indicators, Russia is lower in ratings than the quality of school education. And Russia's assessment can go down, but on the other hand, it will enhance the potential growth of human capital. This shows how and the way we included human capital index into long-term growth model for GDP. With all other conditions equal, this growth level is proportionate to the human capital index. Going over to the conditions making possible to implement this growth model based on human capital, one should mention the budget and fiscal policy as a key source for implementing effective reforms in this area. Recently, the total healthcare and educational expenditure relative to GDP have been stagnating. And even with having national projects where human capital is a priority, we see in the near 3 years the overall expenditure on human capital relative to GDP is not going to increase compared to the inertial curve. According to estimates made also by HEC experts in developing the draft of the strategy, it was suggested that human capital funding should be increased by 1% of GDP and then maintain it at the same level for long term. But this requires some redistribution of resources and a softening of the fiscal policy. compared to now. With regard to effects that this can produce, we compare two scenarios to show the effect from additional investment into human capital. The conventional or inertial scenario is a kind of virtual because it provides for maintaining the same expenditure in human capital. On the other hand, it shows that all measures being taken to improve educational system, healthcare system are not producing substantial effects. So with the healthcare and education actually being kept within the inertial scenario. Nevertheless, the contribution of human capital economic growth will continue to be 0.2%, and the human capital index will increase insubstantially by 2035. From the point of view of its input in contribution to economic growth, human capital will not significantly impact overall economic growth rates, and other inertial growth factors like investment contribution will be maintained, the labor contribution will be negative throughout this projected period. The only thing that can maintain and anchor the economic growth rate at the 2% level is gradual reconstitution of total factor productivity to the levels that we saw in the past 2 decades. In the past several years, total productivity rate has been contributing 0% to the economic growth rate. So this inertial conservative scenarios imply some restoration or reconstitution. Without it, the long-term growth rate will be closer to 1%, 1.5%. A successful best scenario that we are considering includes an active human capital policy. That's a key factor and prerequisites. The level of budget expenditures on human capital in this scenario will contribute to successful policy in healthcare, educational, demography, which will reduce the loss of able-bodied population, working age populations, and will stop population size decline. And this will require, besides incentivizing natural growth, we also include in this scenario accelerated improvement of healthcare, educational levels by 2035, including testing outcomes. That's quite an optimistic scenario that shows a much more substantial human capital index growth to 0.95. And this almost full use of the human development potential, they will increase human capital contribution to 0.70.8% a year, which is quite a significant effect. We're not saying it's the only factor that will be needed to achieve target growth rates exceeding the world growth rates. Of course, investment measures are needed that were discussed, a change in the structure of investment in favor of effective infrastructure investment, in favor of private investment, away from government investment, and a great acceleration of total factor productivity, which is impossible without institutional change, better protection of businesses, competitive environment, without which effective business operation is impossible, or the use of human capital in national economy. Thank you. Thank you, Natalia. We move on to what I call discussion of the HSE report. I hope that Ksenia, to whom I will give the floor, can discuss a wide range of issues, and not only those touched upon in the HSE report. First Deputy Chair of Central Bank, Yudaeva Ksenia. Thank you very much. Quite a few interesting aspects have been touched upon that significantly contributing to living standards and growth, provided there's financial stability. And I, for one, will dwell on the challenges that we see for price and financial stability. If one looks back, like a few months or a year back, the main challenge with regard to price stability in terms of central bank was the effect of various factors of inflation expectations and inflation. That's a VAT rise and price hikes domestically and worldwide for certain commodity groups, and some devaluation of the exchange rate that we saw last year. We had some apprehensions with regard to the secondary effects that could affect inflation rates. So we try to be proactive and raise the policy rate twice last year, and the outcome that we see and the effects that we observe currently shows that inflation pressure was lower than there were scenarios. The VAT effect was quite muted alongside with other factors, and one should note a change in the situation globally. In the end of last year, we observed considerable volatility. Now the situation came back to normal, and that contributed to stabilization of inflation risks and expectations in Russian national economy. And as it has been hinted here, that demand has a moderate effect on inflation. We view the situation in the economy as being close to balance, equilibrium, with equilibrium with some not very high growth rates. And other indicators are historically at low levels. And we don't see considerable inflation risk, but potential for economic growth is related to the factors that have been discussed.
They are related to the investment climate, the human capital, and I would even go as far as say that it is related not to the accumulation of human capital, but the utilization of the human capital. It seems to me that some of our problems with the inflation climate do not allow us to use that human capital that we already have. And that is why these are two interrelated problems or issues that need to be dealt with together, taken together. Let me go back to the issue of financial stability. As far as stability is concerned, one could mention a number of potential risks for the short and medium term. There are external risks primarily, and that's the situation on the global markets. There's a possible outflow of capital that could be caused by economic and geopolitical factors. By and large, our market has adapted to such risks and changes. In most cases, we do not take any steps or take minimal measures to adapt, but of course we need to monitor those risks very closely and always be prepared to adjust our policies. And as I said, changes could be caused by economic and geopolitical factors. Speaking about the geopolitical factors, I would like to mention the reduction of the economic growth rates in the world, the economic slowdown, and in general, we've already seen cases at the beginning of this year where the policies of the leading central banks of developed countries has changed drastically or significantly, and that means that at this stage of the economic cycle, the policies are getting a little bit less predictable, and they can undergo adjustments and corrections more frequently, and we have to be ready for that. Speaking about the domestic internal risks, I would like to say that most of the internal risks to financial stability are associated with the accumulation of the excessive debt and or debt burden. This excessive debt burden is definitely something that slows down the economic growth for the long haul, and it can result in social issues and so on. If we look at where we have this excessive debt burden, in what sectors of the economy, here's what really worries us. Number one, consumer lending is really growing explosively. This is something that is not distributed evenly, but still we have some strata of the population where the debt burden is high, and that's where you need to monitor the situation closely. We've taken cool-down measures to cool this market down, and we are introducing regulation starting this year, new coefficients of payment burden that will be taken into account when we are leveraging the financial sector, the banks and micro-organizations, so that the disadvantaged borrowers couldn't be facing rapidly growing debt burden, or to ensure that the banks or the microfinance companies could be ready to absorb those risks associated with the debt burden from these categories. The next risk is the high debt burden of some companies, or a bad financial position of some companies. In some cases, we can talk about really a bad situation in some sectors of the economy. A few words about our developers. This is the problem that is being discussed quite widely, and they are switching to a new model of working with the people using escrow accounts. And the difficulty with switching to the new system is not in the model itself, but it's rather related with the less than good financial status of the developers and the borrowers themselves, and there's been inadequate control over costs, and those risks had been put on the shoulders of the borrowers that acted as the creditors of this company that created problems without that were borrowing to build their own homes. We need to realize that the sector needs to radically change how they manage their funding and the financial situation they are in. And that's when the model will start working, will become operational. The next problem is the problem with the debt burden in all companies where it can be excessive. We always need to remember that such problems with these companies, especially if these companies are large, they can become a problem for the budget or for the entire country through the financial markets. And we are proud of our balanced budget, but we also realize that debt problems could easily be pushed to the budget, and we need to again monitor that. And at the central bank we are developing measures to improve control over the debt burden on the companies in order to improve the buffers and the reserves that the financial system should have if such companies are credited and provided loans. Another important risks include dollarization of savings. We've seen some positive trends here, however, and we can see that the dollarization of loans is going down. Last year was yet another year when currency loans significantly shrunk and were replaced with ruble loans. Speaking about the budget policy, I would like to say how the budget policy affects the pricing and financial stability. And I would like to say that over the last several years, the effect of the budget policy has been generally positive. The fiscal rule, the indexation of tariffs tied to the target inflation that helped us reduce the inflation to the target level and to reduce inflationary expectations and to reduce the risk of financial instability. There have been some one-off pro-inflationary effects, including the ones caused by the VAT, were not really manifesting themselves too significantly. But this process is coming to an end. We're now at a stage where the budget is beginning to spend more and spend more on investments, among other things, and therefore of key importance for stability is the fact that these investments and these efforts need to be effective, that they need to accelerate the potential economic growth rate, and otherwise they will create inflationary risks, and that is something that we would like to avoid by all means. In conclusion, I would like to say that as the representative of the central bank, I'm talking about the financial and price stability, and that speaks to the fact that what's happening in our economy is this subject is becoming a little bit less important because the level of risks has been reduced and the level of stability has been enhanced. But this doesn't mean that we can sort of sit idle and relax and stop monitoring the risks and make mistakes, because we know how quickly the situation may turn around. And we know that the pricing and financial stability is not the only factor, but one of the key factors that create the environment for economic growth that is based on productivity improvement and long-term investments and innovations. So everything that contributes to the growth and the improvement of living standards, because the living standards is ultimately, that's what's important, and not just the statistical numbers of economic growth. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Yudaeva. There is one more argument in favor of your statement that the central bank is talking about the financial and pricing stability, is the fact that the central bank is so independent that nobody really goes after this stability, even the Ministry of Finance. Of course, the experts can criticize that, but I would like to remind you that Mr. Mao listed among those positive factors the financial stability that has been achieved. And for Mr. Siluanov, it's almost like an axiom. And now I would like to give the floor to Mikhail Zadornov, who represents the other side. Открытие, the bank that he represents, is a structure that will become a private bank soon. The conditions haven't become ripe yet, but he will soon be able to represent the organization where the central bank is the main shareholder, but also take a look at the situation from the perspective of the banking sector. Thank you. Dear colleagues, here's what I would like to begin with. I think that the Ministry of Finance has done a lot over the last 4 years. And I am recalling 2014 and 2015, and back then I couldn't even expect that over the next 4 years the Ministry of Finance, given the political situation, would be able to consolidate the budget in such a way that they did, going back from really a deficit budget to a surplus budget. And the surplus could be expected to be higher than last year's 1.8. It could be close to 3%. And over this time, our colleagues have really turned the situation around, getting rid of those expenses that started back in 2007 and then were exacerbated by the 2009 and 2010 crisis. It should also be noted that right now the monetary and lending policy of the central bank and the Ministry of Finance are well coordinated with each other, which was not the case before. And traditionally, where they diverged, I'm talking about the Ministry of Finance and the central bank, those differences are insignificant right now. There are some minor differences, but they are not irreconcilable. Speaking about the budget consolidation, I would like to say that what is happening in Russia's history is that this is a very unique situation where we have a very good level of interaction of all of the key authorities in the area of the economic sector. And I agree with what Mr. Makarov said, that there are risks of a global crisis or a global slowdown, but if we have the floating rate that is used in our monetary policy and that reserve that has been built into our budget, institutionally we are much better prepared for such a potential slowdown. If we look at the surplus of current account of close to 9% of the GDP, plus a close to 3% surplus of the GDP, that is something that gives us good grounds to prepare for a potential crisis. And I think anything over that would be just doing too much. That is a positive development, and one has to recognize this. The other point I would like to make, speaking about the human capital, is this. We have to recognize that the people of Russia, and when we talk about human capital, we're talking about the income. We have been seeing the decline in real income of our people. And compared with December of 2014, the decline was close to 20% in real terms. And people are getting grumpy about this, and this is also goes in parallel with lack of outlook of why your income could grow later on. That is something that is creating a real concern. Speaking about the recent IMF data for 2018, I can give you some numbers. 30 largest countries, and in that list, Russia's place per capita GDP is now in 22nd place out of the 30 largest economies. It's $11,000 of income per capita. We are still ahead of Kazakhstan and Argentina, Brazil and Turkey, where their incomes have fallen, and that of South Africa, but we are still lagging behind even the Central European nations quite significantly. We don't have yet the data from the World Bank or the IMF about the average disposable income per purchasing power parity, but the most recent data, that is 2015, Russia, suggests that Russia had that at $18,000 per household versus $36,000 in Germany, that's twice as much, or $22,000 in the Czech Republic, that's Central Europe. It seems to me that looking at the way the exchange rates are changing in those countries, the situation shouldn't have changed by 2018, and that a proportion should have been preserved. And in fact, over the last decade, we have slipped from position 43 or 45. Now we're down to 68. That's as far as the household per capita disposable income, or rather household income. And that's not just the perception that your income is slipping. It's just the understanding that people get when they travel abroad. They see how people are doing, and they are aware that they are lagging behind in terms of economic growth. And people have this very distinct idea that in terms of the level of income and the level of opportunity, we have really been lagging behind from, or rather behind the number of developing nations quite significantly over the last 5 years. That includes the Central Europe and some Asian countries. So, if one is to talk about future income growth, and that means the improvement of our human capital, it would be good if we did this not through the redistribution of funds as we had done in the past, but rather, and that's what the government is doing, through the growth of the economy and through the growth of investment. And let me briefly make a few points. And I agree with many things that Mr. Makarov said. What do I believe the government should do to address this problem? Because you cannot really go with the inertial scenario. First of all, the budget needs to decentralize the sources of income and expenses. The budget is overly federalized, if I may use the expression, and of course it is unfair when regions are given certain sources of income that they spend them according to their volition, and we've had cases where governors were prosecuted for that. But we've seen regions that could create good municipalities that would have good income. Let's take the example of the Tyumen Oblast or the Khanty-Mansi Okrug, or Yamal, Yakutia, and Sakhalin. If we look at those regions, we would see that the reasonable budgetary policy that is supported by good levels of income, that could lead to a very good development of these areas. So, the question of at least partial decentralization of authority and income is something that is on the agenda.
We cannot run away from this. The second condition, and we are fully aware of that, is relieving the sanctions pressure and politically going away as to the extent possible from this danger and threat of sanctions, not just impeding investment or technological development. Clearly, this threat of sanctions de facto creates uncertainty that does not allow either major projects or specific activities from normally developing. The third thing is trust and confidence, not only on the part of businesses, but the public, toward the possibility of investing inside the country. It's a matter of the rules of the game, the ownership rights. Law enforcement was mentioned. I would also mention the judicial system in Russia. Banks always have to deal with dials. 2 weeks ago, at Treaty Bank, 2017, there was provisional management. End of year, the debt accumulated by previous owners was 390 billion rubles. 1 month before the provisional management came in, severance pay was worth 0.7 billion rubles. Unjustifiable action. This covered 80 people. Out of this, 70 people, through negotiations, voluntarily gave this money back. For 7 people, we had to go to court. And now it's a voluntary return, but 2 weeks ago, 2 members of the board of former Открытие Bank, 2 judges in arbitration court, same action, they made 2 opposite decisions. One judge decided to return the bonus. The second judge, same day, in the Court of Arbitration, not to return the money. We don't have the case law, common law, but when one sees these things, how can one respond except giving a smile and a sense of humor, enhancement? And similar decisions can be found in our judicial system and a big number. A few specific comments on fiscal policy. The economic program for the subsequent period was substituted by national projects. But if one travels across regions, they're not communicated to the regions in terms of sectoral development. But with regard to regional programs, 1 quarter later, regions do not understand what the practical content of these national projects, which means 2019 is going to be lost from the point of view of utilization of federal funds and regional budgets. And at best, second half of the year is preparation of national projects and their future use. The second comment is every year, and we see it from the banking perspective, we see a tightening of control oversight over utilization of budget sources, which may renders practically unimplementable those control and oversight formats. They work not for the sake of control or oversight, but for the sake of purpose of impeding the use of government money. People are tried to be too cautious and avoid punishment, which impedes any investment projects implementation, having any amount of federal money. And the third situation with not very high growth rates and federal subsidies. They are 500 and 550 billion rubles in total. They are quite often substituting or actually impacting competition in many areas. So it's about the mechanism of these subsidies and use of subsidies for investment purposes. And growth is one separate issue for tactical budget and fiscal policy. Thank you, Mikhail. The way I see it 20 years later, after you were first Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, you envy your colleague that he has a professor and he had to borrow. I don't envy Anton Sinlalov. So his problems are comparable to 98 and 95. Each time period has its own issues, but regard to coordination of economic policy, this whole structure and relations with the central bank is quite right. So you are in support that Minister of Finance and Minister of Economic Development, also financier, we need to accelerate. So therefore, I would ask Alexander Auzan to take the floor and touch upon all the aspects or some of the aspects of today's discussion. I congratulate my colleague on the anniversary conference, and hopefully we'll celebrate, all of us, the anniversary of my teacher, Professor Yasin. Several aspects. Number one is the challenges we face for our scenarios, the growth rate, and number three is human capital. Let's start with the challenges. It would appear to me that we are not saying everything when we discuss the challenges facing the country, because there is a danger of turbulence in the world markets, but in my view, there are more serious factors that were mentioned in passing. The sanctions against Russia were introduced by 97 countries. We are in a trade war with half of the world, and quite a protracted war. You mean in terms of number of countries or the population size? In terms of GDP, it's more than a half, the half of the world. So this country is trying to resolve and deal with the social economic issues alongside with the considerable investment into military-industrial complex. We are in the arms race, and now we will have to undertake a social maneuver. And I don't quite see how we can tackle all these three issues same time. And this situation generates not only risks, but also trends. Number one is state capitalism. I think it's a pretty stable and sustainable trend of state capitals. We virtually stopped discussing privatization or national reform. We talk about national projects and strategy. And the first question is how we can use state capitalism. First, we should make use of it and then think of how we can get out of it. I think it does determine significantly this state capitalist trend when we are to tackle in parallel the military-industrial, social-economic development, and have maneuver with resources. Ksenia pretends she doesn't hear me. The accusations against the central bank of consolidation of the banking system, of leaving only state-owned banks. But why these complaints? Is it different in other areas? The central bank, Ksenia does not hear what I'm saying, but Alexander does. The central bank is promoting competition between government banks and online banking. It's an attempt to use state capitalist institutions and mechanisms. What Vladimir called the strategy and strategies is quite symptomatic too. I will take issue with Vladimir. Mao, I think it was Dr. Kuzminov said, one thing is a program, another thing is the strategy. Strategy is not only a forecast of the future, which may prove to be wrong, but it's also our desire for a certain future. We cannot forecast typhoons or tsunamis in the southern part of the Atlantic Ocean. It does not mean we cannot say in what direction we are sailing. We may be sailing to South America or Southeast Asia. So talk of a strategy is inevitable and unavoidable. Another issue, conversion, which is now called diversification. We see the major results in military technological development, how this can be emulated in the economy. Our 15 billion will not turn into 30 billion. From dependent territories, we only have expenditures. They don't buy military services. And so the issue of conversions is quite serious, and we should look for mechanism of conversion, having in mind the sad experience of the Soviet Union. The whole word, the use of the word is banned because of this. I think we should talk about the use of human capital in the defense industry and making use of this in private companies working for the defense and companies working for the global market are two different animals. Without transferring these teams from defense industry into another area, we cannot come up with world-level state-of-art technologies. Robert Allen, the historian of industrialization and modernization, took out a smartphone and said, the only thing that you can make is defense industry, and the smartphone is a product of the military defense industry. Can you come up with something else? The era of the previous conversion drives was trying to produce household appliances using military technologies. We need to create new sectors. With regard to growth rates, I fully agree with what Vladimir Mao said. It's long-term rates that are important, not only 6-year-long rates. Why immediate growth rates are important in 2018 and 19? For the past 2 years, we've seen a kind of dynamics. Mikhail was speaking about 5-year period of decline of population incomes. For the past 2 years, we see an onset of growth and continued decline of people's incomes. It's partially the reason why 2018 we saw a major decline in the trust level of people toward authorities. The social contract is virtually fallen apart. On the one hand, We have seen a decline of real disposable incomes. And on the other hand, the national economy is growing and people's incomes are going down. Countries with bad institutional environments, they're the outcomes of the national economy. Growth rates are recaptured because these are rent-oriented, extractive institutions that are still in place. And I don't think that we can break this trend having less than a 3% national economy growth. And this mentioned in State of Union address. The social instruments in the HSC paper are interesting. I'm not sure that the government in its present form can implement this trickle-down program. So they will continue to increase the growth rates. Yes. Now the greatest reliance is on government reliance, which will lag behind. And 2019 is not likely to produce any signs of this investment-led growth. I'm not going to discuss near-term consequences. Let me mention the alternative option, growth option. Russia has a huge growth resource and potential because we have very high transaction costs. There was a paper, Aljana Caillou, French economist, about the link between the social capital dynamic and GDP per capita, 2010. And they analyzed and calculated the GDP per capita in a country if confidence and trust level were like in Sweden. In England, it would be 7% higher, in Germany 9%, Czech Republic 20%. In Russia, it would be GDP per capita would be 69% higher than currently, because we are losing so much on transaction costs, mutual lack of trust and confidence. And I would like to respond to this general discussion of the enforcement impact on investment climate. I agree with Yaroslav Kuzmin. We need specific decisions in place. And I may hint what kind of decisions. Not police Weingast, in violence and social order, when they discussed borderline conditions for higher trajectory access, is how elites control tools of violence through distribution and division or consolidated. Now the elites control the tools of violence by dividing them. One group is in control of part of tools of violence, the other, you're talking about the joint investigating committee, there's talk. So we have greater consolidation in store for us. I think this consolidation should go beyond the investigating commission. In the history of this country, we had a long period when we had consolidated control over tools of violence. 53 to 91, Politburo collectively was controlling tools of violence. This cost the career of Marshal Zhukov because one person cannot exert a single influence on armed forces. When Andropov was elected Secretary General, he was isolated from the KGB. So the system did work. Whom did you suggest and propose to be isolated? We need a new format for the Security Council, which should have procedures and protocols involving the economic bloc, because the effect of tools of violence and institutions of violence has also this aspect in place.
And the very last thing I wanted to talk about is, of course, the matter of the human capital. I wholeheartedly agree with the authors of the paper that this is a very important factor of development, especially given that this is the future of the country. And in general, Russia, in addition to hydrocarbons, has three factors that can position it high on the global map. It includes its territory. If we are able to build the right infrastructure, if not, then what will happen is what Nikolai Berdyaev described as the country that is affected by its own size. It's the defense potential. We are the inheritors of two empires, and the human capital. And I think the future is to go with the human capital. We want to be the country of smart people and not the country that can boast its defense industry. But I'm not sure that if you just invest directly in the human capital, it will give you the right yield. Let's look at what the institutional framework these investments would have to go through. Okay, it's going to be sensitive in this room, but let's take something that is different from the economy. Let's take healthcare. Since 2006, since the first national project was started, a huge amount of money was invested in healthcare. What has this resulted in? Well, yes, they've built a lot of buildings. They've bought equipment that doesn't fit in those buildings. And this does not come with disposable materials or with the proper training of the personnel to use it. So we're going back to the same level. With the digital healthcare, we're going to the same level. Right, we're going to have some buying taking place. Everyone will be satisfied with the purchases, but will not achieve the desired result. So the situation with the healthcare is dramatic. Okay, what is our healthcare model? Is this insurance-based? No. We don't see the factors that really describe a true insurance-based. Shall we go back to the budget-based one, like in England or in Canada? Then we would need to raise our income tax, because it's very expensive. So, unless we build an institutional infrastructure, investing money there would be madness. And if we talk about education, I would like to refer to what Natalia mentioned earlier. And I've already mentioned this in this room. Look at the international ratings. Our children at the initial level are among the best one. In middle school, they're at level 32. And then as far as the higher school is concerned, that's where we have a lot of discrepancies there. Demand on the international labor market, the 112th and so on place. We see that our human capital is degrading, and it's not just because people are leaving the country. The talented ones are leaving, and the ones that are coming are not really that talented. But there's another reason for that. There was a joke in the old days that education is a process of fighting between the education system and the natural giftedness of the individuals. And I think we are winning that battle. I think we need to change our education model. I think we need to change our healthcare model. If we don't do this, investments are not going to give us the desired result. Thank you. Mr. Auzan. The discussion is just beginning, and it's time for us to wrap up. That's too bad, because this is our first session. There will be follow-up sessions, including a session at 5 o'clock. There will be a discussion on the goals of social development of the country, and that's when we will be able to continue this discussion on the role of the human capital and the various development models for the social sphere sectors. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Yasin, Evgeny Yasin, to say some final remarks, considering that he is the person behind all of these conferences. And since this is a Jubilee one, he doesn't have to start the discussion. He can just make a big speech, a celebratory speech. I am of the position that I'm a co-author of the report presented by Natalia Akindinova, and I share the statements made in the paper. And Natalia was very convincing in laying out our position in that presentation of hers. And I would like to note, dear colleagues, that on the one hand, we are together trying to make a lot of progress. We've seen a lot of progress demonstrated to us by the Ministry of Finance, and same goes for the central bank. They go hand in hand with each other, which is something new. But then we start talking about what are the drawbacks and what doesn't work and what does. But I agree with both of the two visions. Well, one of the things is our hope, and the other thing is what we see. And we find it appropriate and find it our duty to mention those negative things, negative sides. And I think things like that are very tangible. Well, the farther this room is from where they work, the more they will be willing to show what they think and what they feel. Those that are remote from where we are, they are harsh critics, and we didn't criticize things that harshly ourselves, and that has its own explanation. But ultimately, let me say that I need at least a week to think over what I had heard here. Because based on my convictions, we should have a good result in order to have good relations with our leadership, the government, and so on. But we are also decent people. And we need to say how things are in reality. And we need to be as straightforward as Mao was. And so we may have an alternative point of view. And this is not something that concerns me for a very simple reason. There are audiences with whom you can discuss these issues, and if that's the case, then that's a good thing. And if not, that's an open question. So I will be thinking about this. I will be pondering this for about a week. And to be very honest with you, I'm looking at your faces, and I have this very warm feeling towards you. And I have the desire to continue this common cause we are working towards. But what's going to be the outcome? And that's something that remains an open question, because there are a lot of things that have been said have been critical of what's going on. I have this impression that such deliberations are kind of typical for everyone who is present here. But let me say that the situation now is such that here at this conference we have two papers on the nature of the market economy development. Two papers, as I said. One of the papers is the paper presented today by Natalia Akindinova. You heard it today. And the other will be on a similar topic, on an adjacent topic, And outside in the hallway, you can find on the desks books that you can take and read. And as someone who has contributed to both of those papers, I can tell you that there are indeed similar ideas in both papers. And those who contributed to these papers are our professors who, for about a year, have been working on preparing a new textbook on the economic development. And so we have a desk outside where we'll put those brochures and those books. I'm not sure that all of you are going to be able to get those books today, because maybe the quantity we have is not sufficient. Maybe we've run out of them, but still you will see some of them. This is the result of the work by our noted experts, such as Ms. Avdasheva and the others who worked with her. All I'm trying to say is that if you step outside and pick up a book there, that they are different authors than Nakindino, but they all start with an A. It's good that they all end with the last letter of the Russian alphabet. You know, I'm a fairly old hand. I'm turning 85 this year. Get ready. It's going to be on the 7th of May. We're going to have a celebration. Where are you inviting us, Mr. Yasin? There will be two groups. We are ready to stay in line. It's going to be at the Higher School of Economics. I would like to thank Mr. Yasin first and foremost as the initiator and the founder of the April conferences, and as the author of the annual reports and papers that are discussed at the April conferences. And he's been on the headmaster of both of them. He didn't say where they diverge. They converge, as he said. Okay, that's a good thing. Although it would have been good, maybe, if they were a little bit different to initiate a further discussion. But let me say that we are talking about the following. On the 17th of April, there will be a discussion of a work by Avdasheva, and maybe those ideas are going to be a little bit different. But the mood, the tenor of those books is quite similar still, because we work and live in one university. Okay, dear colleagues, despite the fact that the April conference is the one that is the 20th, and it's an international one, and we're here to show our solidarity with the government and with the community, and also at the same time express a number of ideas regarding how to transform our economic and social policies, and all of the policies that are being implemented by the government. We want to make sure that they're more effective. So the critical attitude is not just a demonstration of a new vision. We've always been different in that we've always come up with very serious recommendations, and HSC, thanks to this constructive approach, has always been a lead expert, think tank, if you will, for the government and for the President's administration and for other federal agencies. And I think in that sense, the April conference and today's session was very important. I would like to thank all of the speakers. This is going to be a very significant contribution to the attainment of that objective of our interactions with the government, between the HSE and the government in all those streams of activities. And Alexander spoke about the need to have certain delineation of responsibility, but I think convergence is good. And again, I apologize for taking too long with my moderation, but you were fortunate that Mr. Kudrin traveled to Shanghai, and now he's traveling to the controllers meeting in the United States, and Mr. Areshkin had to travel to the Arctic Forum in St. Petersburg or somewhere else. Otherwise, we would have still been here and skipped our lunch break. So the next meeting would be here at 5 o'clock, and physically I would have been criticized harshly for this lack of time discipline. I understand that time moves on, and it's time for us to have our lunch break. Thank you.